Hello and welcome back to WiiM Audio. Today we're having a Chinese R2R DAC off. R2R, that's resistor to resistor DACs, not a chip DAC. The two DACs we have chosen today to pit against each other are the Gustard, sounds like custard, but it's the Gustard R26 and the Denafrips Ares12th. Both of these are relatively newly released at the end of 2022, and I decided I would buy both of them to review. Why did I buy them? Well, I wanted to make sure that I was reviewing what you would get. Not saying that golden samples go around of R2R DACs, but I have heard that that sometimes maybe does happen. Not suggesting Denafrips and Gustard do that, but I wanted to make sure that what you receive is what I've received and you get an honest opinion of them both. Now, why have I chosen these two R2R DACs and not the others? I mean, there's a Ladder Schumann, there's plenty of other choices. Well, in one word, it's hype. Hype, 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 because the original Ares DAC, which looked very similar to this 12th version, that had a huge amount of hype when it was released originally. So much so, loads of people bought them, and I did too. And it was a great DAC. And yeah, do you know what? I liked it, but it wasn't a giant killer. It wasn't something that I thought was competing with £3,000–4,000 DACs. And with these two DACs, specifically this R26 actually, which has just come out recently, that's also got a lot of hype. So we've got the original Hypester, which is the Ares, and the new version of it. And we have the new kid on the block, the R26, which is a mega hyped R2R DAC. Now, let's get this out of the way. These are both great DACs. So if you're sitting there having bought either of these DACs, have no remorse because they are fantastic value for money in their price category. But however, don't be sitting there thinking, I have got a DAC which is as good as or better than a Molo Tambaqui. No, it's not as good as that. It's not as good as a Hollow Audio May. It's not as good as a Denafrips Terminator, but it is very good, both of them, for their price point. And we'll talk more about what they do well. But what's the big difference between the giants and this? Well, I mean, everything's just a little bit better in those sort of DACs. You know, in the Molo Tambaqui, that is the king of resolution and imaging. These can't compare. With the Hollow Audio May, that gives you that spatial information and that sense of place and the sort of atmosphere. These can't compete with that. In the Denafrips, it's all about that kind of rhythmic punch and the all-round presentation that is very, very satisfying, including resolution, which is great. Again, these can't compete with that. That said, they're very good, and we're going to get into why I think they are. Now, let's just take 1 second to talk about the Ares 2 versus the Ares12th. A few of you might have an Ares 2, and you might be thinking, what's the difference? Is there any? Well, I don't have an Ares 2 here now, so this is from memory, but I did own one for over a year, and I can tell you now that this is a much more rounded DAC, the Ares12th, and it is better. So if you're sitting there at the moment thinking, shall I buy the Ares 2, which they've renamed the Enyo, or the new 12th, I would strongly advise, unless you like a more forward presentation, to go for the 12th, because I think in general it's just a little bit better in all the right places in a way that it justifies the increase in cost. That's my view of the 2, now called Enyo, versus the 12th. Okay. However, if you've got the 2 and you want to make a big step up, that's not the 12th either. You'd have to spend quite a lot more to get a lot more. Okay, moving on then. So let us talk a little bit about these two DACs and what they bring to the table. Specifically, I think we'll do a little bit of a tour, and we'll talk as well about this unique features of both. And there aren't always a lot of unique features in DACs because they are just taking a digital signal and converting it into an analog one and making lovely music for your amplifier to amplify. But the R26 down here, this is a streaming R2R DAC, which is quite unique. I don't know actually of any other streaming R2R DACs. I know quite a few chip DACs which are streaming, but I don't know of many R2R ones. And you can plug via UPnP, you can plug in via the Ethernet and get Rune, which is fantastic as an endpoint. And of course you can use an external streamer as well. But we do have a bit of a mismatch there, don't we? Because this is a streaming DAC and the Denafrips isn't, it's just a pure DAC. So enter the equation, this, the WiiM Pro. Yes, I'm going to get on the bandwagon and say this is amazing value for money. Don't bother with your setup if it includes, well, if you've got one already and you like it, do go with a Raspberry Pi, but don't bother getting a Raspberry Pi over a WiiM Pro because the WiiM is just so much better. Better in terms of sound quality, it's clearer, it has really good clarity. That's what defines the WiiM as a pure streamer. Let's not talk about it as a DAC. That's a bit, it's all right, but it's not great. But as a pure streamer, very nice and clear, and the software is blooming marvellous, and Roon is coming apparently to this. So in terms of a comparison, let's add the WiiM or WiiM. I'll go WiiM, sounds a bit more proper English. So the WiiM with the Denafrips now is a combo which is cheaper than the R26 on its own. So we've got an even playing field. Not a streaming DAC, but add this in, same sort of functionality, and actually more functionality is now brought to the party with the WiiM than you get from the streamer in the R26. Okay, fair fight. Let's do a tour. Let's put the WiiM down for a second. Do check that out. They're selling out like hotcakes because they're great. Great work, WiiM. Talk about the Denafrips. First of all, as I said, a pure DAC in a chassis which is very nice and small. It's nicely put together. Lovely front plate. The buttons, can you hear that? They're nice and clicky. They're kind of tactile. It's got standby. All your USB, coax, optical, I2S. That's new for the Ares12th over the Ares2, so you can use a DDC if you want to into it. We'll talk a little bit more about DDC later. You've got an oversample or non-oversampling button now dedicated on the front, which is really good. Mute and phase invert if you want to. On the back, things remain pretty simple. You've got balanced and you've got single-ended connections. You have a nice coax, optical, I2S and USB. Now, in terms of do they all sound good? Yeah, they do. And I've used predominantly USB there, but I've also used coax as well. Coax with the streamer down there, USB with my laptop. Yeah, it does exactly what it says in the tin. It's pretty straightforward. It sounds good, and we'll talk more about the sound later, but it's a solid box. It looks really rather nice. Under the hood, things have changed slightly. They've got bigger, larger capacitors in here, which I think are adding largely to the sound difference. We'll come back to the sound in a minute. Then we've got the R26, a bit bigger. Some people said the internet looks a bit like a set-top box from the 90s. A little bit unfair. Don't think it looks like a skybox. Got quite a nice detailing around the side there. Kind of, I don't know, almost acts as part of the heatsink potentially, but neither of these two DACs get particularly hot. They do get quite cold though, because it's freezing at the moment. It's -3 outside, so I've got the heater on. On the front, you've got a pretty simple on button. It's got a nice feel to it. That does not feel cheap. It's good, good spring. And then a menu button you can spin and select by pressing in the middle. Now, aesthetically speaking, I'm not a fan of what they've done here with the front panel screen. This kind of like half and half thing. It's not for me. I think it's weird. And the menu you get on it when you turn it on is quite small when you adjust the settings and choose the different modes, oversampling, etc., etc. They could have done a better job with that, personally speaking. Some people love that, right? So each their own. But subjectively speaking, I actually prefer the look and the size of Denafrips over the R26. Although this is quite small compared to some R2R DACs. When I used to have a Denafrips Terminator, that thing was massive. Although it sounded great, but it was huge. On the back, again, you've got balanced and single-ended. This is a bit nicer in its layout, I think, to the single-ended and balanced on the Denafrips. But I guess for the Denafrips, we're talking about very small form factor, which is why they've had to squeeze it together. Again, we've got I2S, USB, LAN, that's direct in for the streaming capabilities of UPnP and Roon. An aerial you can put on there for Bluetooth if you want to. Didn't really use Bluetooth. If you've got a DAC that's good, don't Bluetooth to it unless you absolutely have to. I mean, come on, people. Use good sources. Coax, AES, EBU, very good. That's something that you don't get on the Denafrips. Optical, and then you've got a connection here if you want to do a bit of re-clocking via the Gustard re-clocker, and power. So again, pretty straightforward. It is a DAC after all, but it is a streaming DAC, which is why it's got the Ethernet in there. And you're probably saying, come on Dave, cut to the chase, let's just talk about the sound. So let's do that, shall we? Let's talk about the sound of these two DACs. We'll go through the kind of usual stuff, treble, mid-range, bass, bit of imaging, soundstage, and then just a general kind of summary of their sound. Before we get into the detail of that though, I just want to cover off non-oversampling mode. So both of these DACs can run in oversampling mode or non-oversampling mode, and they couldn't be any more different in their approach, or quality of approach, shall I say, to oversampling and non-oversampling. So with the Denafrips, the oversampling mode is on by default, and it sounds brilliant. It's a really, really good oversampling mode. I prefer the slow filter, although the difference between slow and sharp is small, but the oversampling is natural. It just crisps things up a little bit, and it's excellent. It really is. Non-oversampling on the Denafrips sounds a bit woolly, so I'm not a fan of that. And if I was to recommend anything to you, if you're going to get the Denafrips Ares12th, stick with oversampling on. Contrary to that, on the R26, it's the other way around. So with oversampling on, you have three options. You've got kind of low, medium and high, if you like. They've got different options in the menu you can choose. The issue I take with the oversampling mode on the R26 is timing. Now, I'm quite sensitive to timing and also to tone, and the timing is just a bit weird on the kind of lower and the higher settings. On medium, it's pretty good, and you can listen to it fine there if you are like me and you're sensitive to timing, but the other two settings I really don't like. And then the oversampling sound, again, I'm a bit of a fusspot, I'm a bit of a snob when it comes to tone, so tonally it sounds just a tiny bit glassy for me compared specifically to the Denafrips' approach to oversampling. So I actually prefer the R26 in non-oversampling mode. That said, the non-oversampling mode is a lot better and less fuzzy than the Denafrips one. And if I was going to use oversampling in Roon, for example, into a DAC, then I would probably be going down the route of using the R26 more, because actually it does a really good job in that NOS mode. You can also go direct to DSD. I did that a couple of times and that sounds very nice as well. But for most of my listening, I used PCM sources, Redbook sources, and Tidal to stream into both of these. So, treble first of all. Let's talk about the treble from the Denafrips and the R26, because they couldn't be more different. And again, this is horses for courses. They're both really good, but the Denafrips is quite relaxed in the treble. You get the full sort of gamut of information, but it's never really going to put you on edge. And neither does the R26, but it's a lot more airy, and that's what it creates, this kind of sense of place and huge kind of soundscapes. One of the defining factors of the treble here is that it really does give that kind of nuanced approach to detail, which the Denafrips can't really match. The R26 then is very, very good in this regard, but as you come down the frequency range into the mid-range, that's where the Denafrips for me starts to be a little bit better. It's sort of clearer on vocals, it's got a bit more density as well. And then again into the bass, the Denafrips for me, particularly with oversampling on, just has a better foundation to the sound, and the tonality across the board is more to my preference. Gustard feels very, very airy, but then that foundation isn't quite as even-handed as the Denafrips. Going to soundstage, Denafrips it's not narrow, but it is definitely narrower than the R26. The R26 is something spectacular when you put it on. It's so wide, and this is actually one of the areas where it is a bit of a giant killer. It reminded me of when I used to have a Denafrips Terminator, because it is super, super wide. There's a sense of height as well. It's spread out all over the place, and big orchestral numbers. It's quite a tour de force. It's in your face. It's all over the place. I absolutely loved it. Denafrips is much more reserved. It's kind of just wide of the plane of the speakers. There's a nice bit of height, and both of them do depth quite well. They're not cavernous, but there is a sense of layering within both of these DACs. But the Denafrips is kind of contained within itself. It is a master of all trades. It's very good across the entire frequency spectrum. It's very good in terms of the width and the depth, but it's not spectacular. It's not the DAC you get out to show off to your mates. That's the R26. You get the R26 out to someone that's not really into hi-fi, say, sit down and listen to this, because then suddenly they'd go back in their chair and go, wow, that's incredible. I could hear sounds everywhere. It's really holographic. The Denafrips, I think, is something that you consider more as a bit of a long-term audiophile, someone that's kind of got over that initial excitement of the crazy imaging of soundstage and just wants something which is good across the board. Perhaps this one actually is better if you're listening to vocals and sort of less complicated tracks, and then the R26 is just going to give you everything. It's the full beans every time. But in the bass, it doesn't really give you a lot of slam, the R26. That's an area potentially of weakness. Neither really does the Ares12th, but I think the bass is more satisfying, again, because that even keel approach, you don't notice the kind of lacquer slam that you might get in perhaps a chip DAC like a Sabre, or you know, certainly against something like a Mola Tambaki, the bass slam is completely different, leagues apart, and you'd expect so because of the price difference. Mention the Mola Tambaki because that is, of course, my reference DAC at the moment. Something else even more spectacular potentially is coming down the line. More on that in a later video. So we have even-handed, not spectacular, but very, very satisfying versus Impress Your Mates. It's out there in terms of air, gives huge height and width, and is very, very exciting, but perhaps has some weaknesses in terms of bass slam and mid-range clarity. What would I buy? I mean, I have bought both of them. Which one would I keep? I'm not going to keep either of them. I'm going to put them both on eBay because I need more money to spend on more things to review for all of you. But if I was to keep one of them, it would probably be the Ares with the WiiM Pro. Why? I think it's cheaper, first of all. You know, I could save a few £100, which is good. I think also it's just that even-handed approach which I prefer more. It reminded me a little bit actually of when I did own that Denafrips Terminator. This feels like it's been tuned now to be a miniature version of that. So it's nowhere near as good as a Terminator, don't get me wrong, but the way it presents music is like almost like it's got shrunk in the wash, both in size and actuality, but also in the way it's presenting the music. There's not quite as much macro or micro dynamics. There's not quite as much in terms of textural information, but it does have that kind of organic tone and feel to it that makes it like a little mini Terminator 1. Never heard the Terminator 2, but certainly Terminator 1, it is very familiar to me, and I like that. And perhaps that's why I'm biased towards the Denafrips, because it's something that I am familiar with and liked before. Okay, two more things to cover off then. Firstly, DDCs, digital to digital converters, or reclockers. Do you need one? Well, that's entirely up to you. I can only give you my subjective view of this, which is both of these DACs on their own, without a DDC, without a reclocker, well, they're both great. Would I spend money on a DDC and the associated cabling to go with this? Probably not. Subjectively, I would prefer to take the money that I would spend on that and invest it in a better DAC. Now, I probably wouldn't go actually from an Ares to a Pontus, although that is a marginally better DAC. It sounds great. I would take a bigger step, you know, go to something like a Venus, for example. Now, that's a much more expensive DAC than either of these two, but I also think you get a much bigger return than potentially spending your money on kind of ancillary tweaks and sort of polishing up the sound through DDCs and reclockers with this sort of technology. I think the sound you get from either of these two is absolutely fantastic on its own, and I would be recommending that you spend time with these DACs as they are and enjoy them for what they are for as long as you possibly can before taking a bit of a leap either to a better DAC or, if you do want to, DDC it up. Secondly, alternatives. What else could you buy for the same sort of money? Well, there are lots of alternatives, aren't there? And actually, there are loads of great alternatives now from the chip DACs, such as, you know, from Topping or SMSL, like the SU10. Some great options there. For me, in this sort of price range, around sort of £1,000 to £1,500, I would be looking at the Chord Cutest. I think that is giving it a different sort of presentation. Certainly if you were into EDM or dance music or wanted something a bit more incisive, a bit faster, I think the Cutest beats both of these. However, if you want something that's very natural and organic sounding, perhaps a little soft around the edges, then here you go. These two are preference. And again, they're at the same sort of level, the Cutest and these two DACs. It's just you get a different flavour of sound, and it's going to be down to your preference and the sort of music you like to listen to, and also your system and partnering equipment as to what you prefer. You can't really go wrong. There's no bad choice to be made here. These are great DACs. The Cutest is a great DAC. Topping do some great chip DACs, so do SMSL and others. But yeah, I mean, we're looking at fantastic value for money here, and really, really top draw DACs at the price point. So really, in summary, that's pretty much it. Great value for money, great sound, very natural, very organic, but different between the two here. You've got excitement with the R26, massive soundstage, particularly the width. Both of them have nice depth, but the R26 really gives you whopping air and lovely sense of place. The Denafrips is more rounded across the frequency band, has a better foundation perhaps than the R26, but is narrower in its presentation. I think a more all-round presentation for the Denafrips, but perhaps not something that you'd show your friends to show off, whereas the R26 is definitely the excitement beast. Both are great. Horses for courses, as per usual in Hifi, of course. Anyway, that pretty much wraps up this review of the R26 and the Denafrips Ares12th. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, we have a super thanks now available on all our videos. We don't do a Patreon, but if you'd like to do super thanks, that's great. It's very much appreciated. If not, that's fine too, because we just love you having along for the ride. And if you would like to like and subscribe, that helps our channel loads as well. So hopefully we'll see you back here very soon for some more content. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you soon.